maestría de alguna manera comparten también en conferencias públicas como esta, no solo con los estudiantes de la maestría, sino también de alguna manera en streaming y en este espacio real, pues algunas ponencias que hacen, y nos gusta compartir este espacio académico. Pero también hay que decirlo que estamos trabajando en una iniciativa que todavía de alguna manera pues no es pública, pero en una idea de pensar un nuevo pregrado que combine la dimensión del paisaje y el urbanismo en relación con el diseño. Sobre eso y algunas preguntas conversaremos más adelante. Mohan Rao es un arquitecto de landscape, de paisaje, experto en ecología urbana y en procesos con las comunidades y en temas ambientales. Es una persona que tiene una carrera muy amplia, dirige el Instituto INDE de Bangalore, trabaja muchísimo en el Asia, en la India, en África. Ahora está acompañándonos en un proceso en Colombia y en el suroeste también, en un proyecto que estamos haciendo juntos. Es una de esas personas que uno se encuentra en el mundo que le prenden una luz cuando uno ve de alguna manera lo que hacen, por su singularidad, pero también por su relevancia y por ser muy distinto, y de alguna manera las respuestas que da a los problemas son extraordinarios. Vamos a ver qué nos presenta hoy, porque tiene muchos trabajos y él escoge qué nos presenta. Esperemos que hubiera escogido bien. Mohan entiende español, pero creo que no me estás entendiendo en este momento. Entiende español, pero nos van a presentar tanto Mohan como Cristian en inglés. Entonces, el trabajo que hace en relación con la restauración ecológica, el manejo del agua, las comunidades, el tema de la combinación desde el punto de vista de combinar procesos de alguna manera humanos, económicos y ecológicos, es realmente muy porque trabaja con la memoria y el conocimiento de los territorios. Tendremos su primera presentación, cada presentación va a durar 30 minutos, después viene Christian Wertmann. Christian es también un gran amigo, está ahora en la Universidad de Leibniz en Hannover. Con él hemos desarrollado un proceso largo de un proyecto de investigación que llamamos nosotros Rehabilitar la Montaña, que empezó cuando Christian lideraba un grupo de investigación en la Universidad de Harvard y después volvió a retornar a su país de origen. Christian es un diseñador de landscape, también experto en sostenibilidad, fue o es director o líder del Hub de Urbanismo Informal de Naciones Unidas, de UN Habitat, una red sobre expertos, instituciones que tratan de alguna manera de innovar y de encontrar respuestas para todo el tema, dijéramos, de la informalidad. Lidera un foro anual que combina investigadores del mundo, doctores y expertos en el mundo sobre este tema. Ha trabajado en muchos contextos como el nuestro, en Haití, en Brasil, en Colombia. Hemos estado también en Mocoa juntos. Y bueno, y tiene una experiencia muy amplia. Entonces yo simplemente les doy la bienvenida a ellos dos. Mohan va a empezar la presentación, va a ser la suya, y si tenemos tiempo, que esperamos tener unos 20 minutos, si tenemos un poco más, para hacer un diálogo y una conversación entre ellos y también con ustedes. Muchas gracias. Mohan. Yo te tengo si quieres.
Gracias. Muchas gracias, Alejandro. And before I start, I must say that I have been spending some time here in Medellin with Urbam, and the quality of the conversations, the level of engagement with social, environmental, urban issues is something that I have not seen of that quality in many places. So I really have to congratulate Urbam for doing an excellent job on this. So when we were discussing the idea of the public presentation, what we wanted to look at was not just environment or society in its different dimensions, but to actually address the issue of transitional landscapes. Now, what exactly does transitional landscapes mean is that, which one does this work? No, it's not working. Like that. Okay, I will do that. So we've been exploring the idea of transitional landscapes as a response to the kind of large-scale transformations our world is seeing, even in terms of not just the extent of urbanization that the world is seeing, but also the speed at which that happens. So the kind of responses that one needs to have for this needs to be very different from the conventional approaches where one would follow it as a sequence of events. The pace of transformations are often very, very sudden. We can witness that in many of our countries, whether it's Colombia, India, Africa, and all these places. And often, many of the stakeholders, whether they're the decision makers or the citizens, do not actually have the opportunity to internalize the kind of challenges. There is very little time to even anticipate the kind of changes that is likely to happen. Huli, I'm going to ask you to come and keep pressing this. Yes, that works. So the basic premise of this investigation is to look at how settlements and landscapes have coexisted across time. If you look at human settlements historically, they have grown over a period of time. There was a certain pace at which they were growing, which meant that there was always a lot of time and opportunity to react both to natural systems and for natural systems to adapt to human interventions. Now, these could have been very small. It could be the Neolithic structures that we see here, where they were very, very small and incidental kind of interventions in the landscape, which as time went on would extend to the settlement level ones. And often to the territorial. There are very, very few regions on the planet which have actually not been transformed by human action. Whether they are good or bad, positive or negative is secondary, but almost every single space except very few pockets in the polar regions or in the Amazon are probably not transformed to a large extent. In fact, what you see here is a 100 square kilometer area which has been transformed over 2,000 years, integrating a very, very intensive water management system. But these need not necessarily be seen as built structures. The transformation could come through land transformations, water systems, biodiversity, and so on. So this kind of a continuous occupation of land across territories has created large-scale transformations. Some of it is visible to the naked eye, sometimes it is not. Now, if you actually look at the process of occupation of territory, it would start from very, very subtle, small interventions in the landscape, where now we have come a full circle. Earlier, we were actually looking at putting habitations in nature, and now we are trying to put nature in our habitation at all scales, whether it is a little indoor plant you have in your house to creating roofscapes and vertical landscapes in any way. There is this need and urge driven by many, many different agendas, but essentially you're actually trying to put the natural system back into the city system. Now, it is quite important to stop at this point to understand why is this need for putting the nature back in the city. If we ignore the aesthetic and spiritual aspect that many people feel the need, is that a lot of the urbanization and settlement patterns that we see have been imposed due to various ideas. They could be aesthetics, they could be ideas of efficiency, engineering, economics. There have been many drivers, especially since the start of the Industrial Revolution, spanning about 2 centuries till now. Now, what often happens is that the impact of these are not immediate, and the impact in the long term hits the most vulnerable of the populations. The impacts could be in terms of the flooding that we see. This is not an anomaly in one city, in one region. My own theory is that exactly like the turn of the 19th century, you saw public health, like plague, being the driver of a different kind of an urbanization, starting from Europe but spread across the world. I think the 21st century cities will actually be transformed by the challenges of flooding and drought, because this is very, very severe. It happens across continents, across latitudes, not limited to the tropics or to the coastal areas. You will be surprised to know that most desert settlements have been continuously and regularly flooding over the last 20 years, if you look at the records. And that's not only because of climate change. Climate change is partially responsible. It's also how we have engineered our cities, and that's largely what is causing this, this phenomena. So while towards the end of the 20th century, there has been this movement to bring back nature in various forms, whether they were driven by needs of recreation or a curiosity of looking at nature. We are at a crossroads where we can no longer treat nature as simply a need for recreation or simply to create relief from a concrete city. You actually need to integrate nature in a way that addresses all the multiple needs, whether it is resilience for food and water and livelihood, to vulnerabilities that is created by many of the natural events. This, I believe, needs to become central, and this is not simply limited to the superficial introduction of green in cities, but where nature and natural systems and the ecosystem services that they provide actually becomes the underlying layer of any intervention in the urban landscape. I would like to step back to kind of build a case for what I'm saying here. This is an investigation of a large metropolitan city that has been kind of frozen in time. This is in southern India. Please remember that this is not a unique case that I'm presenting. I'm simply unraveling the case as a way to understand how settlements had worked in the past and if there are lessons for us in the future. So this particular case that we are looking at is the capital of the Vijayanagar Empire, which grew over 1,000 years, but it reached its zenith around the 16th century. At its time, it was one of the largest metropolitan areas on the planet. It was, depending on the source, it was either the second or the first most dense urban area anywhere in the world. It had a population of about 600,000 people across 120 square kilometers. Now, the reason to study this is not because it was such a gigantic city, but there are other interesting facts that come out. The fact that it sat on a river, but archaeological and epigraphic evidence shows that the city actually did not use the river as a water infrastructure for various reasons. Some of it is philosophical and spiritual, some of it is quite practical. Okay, there is somewhere I need to point, yes. Okay. So the larger landscape that it sits holds the key to how the settlement actually functions. It's not limited to the physical settlement pattern of the structures itself, but the way in which it is integral with the much, much larger landscape. And the city itself has been excavated, documented, studied, conserved over the last 120 years by archaeologists, conservation architects, and a whole team of people. And there is lots and lots of documentation that looks at the built aspect of it, whether it is the art or the culture or the building technology and things like that. But the focus of this particular exploration is not so much to understand the built, but the relationship of the built to the larger environment, which is very, very crucial, which is something that we miss in our conversations, even when we talk of settlements today. How does it sit within the territory? What is its relationship, not just in spatial terms, but in terms of resources, what it does to water, food, waste, and all the other cycles for which most of the time we have engineering solutions, but there is no intrinsic understanding of the relationship of human settlements with the larger environment. So these explorations are interpretations, because there are many, many different ways to read historical settlements. But what is of interest here is you will see that there is not one single large megalithic city. It's a series of settlements that actually sits within the larger landscape. The lines that you see here and in the next few slides are different interpretations of looking at water and slopes and soil quality and things like that. Now, what emerges as an understanding from this is that there was an extremely intricate and very purposeful relationship between what was built, what was used as fertile landscapes, and what was not built upon, which essentially means that there were areas that were identified for building alone, which in light of the previous analysis, we can conclude that what we would in current day conversation call wasteland, which is not productive, is exactly where the built fabric sat, which meant that whatever was fertile with a deeper soil thickness or better access to natural water remained as productive agricultural landscape. So this also brings to question our other imagination of looking at the urban and rural as distinct things. Urban is where the consumption happens, rural is where the production happens of food, which need not necessarily be the case. Historically, there are many examples where they have not been the case. And what is also interesting is the large areas which are left untouched. You will not see a single imprint of any structure on these spaces. And the reason for that becomes apparent. So what I'm briefly showing you is the process of physical conservation that typically happens. And this is important because when we think of conservation or examining historical settlements, our focus is always on the built. We have enormous skills and research and documentation and scholarship on what the built was like. But the exploration here is to see the relationship of the built with the larger landscape. Oh, that's just something that I use to impress people with. That's my hand holding all the gold coins. That does not belong to me. But the idea of showing this is to say that the entire landscape has been explored maybe 20, 30%. Excavations continue to go on. Surprises continue to spring up all the time. So if we were to distill this whole argument into a very childlike understanding, that these are the hills, the rocky hills that you see in the landscape. This area is where all the settlements happened, whether they were temples or marketplaces or houses. And what you can actually see is that what has been left as open space or unbuilt space is essentially used as a giant water management structure. The entire hill and the rocky landscape becomes a water management strategy. What you can see in many of the hills are not exactly built structure, but a series of interventions that happen in the landscape. It could be a detention pond somewhere, a contour trench in another place, which guides the water in certain areas, not necessarily built. But it's important to realize that they are not collecting surface runoff alone, but using the entire hill as a giant sponge to hold the rainwater, because soil storage is one of the most sustainable and safest ways to hold water in the long term. And the same process of excavation, you may see the dates that are mentioned. It's obviously a very, very long and time-consuming process, but a landscape that would look like this would be excavated and each of the stones put back till it actually starts looking like this. Now, as an architectural conservation, this is great. But what was also being done in parallel was the investigations on the hills that we looked at. Clearing silt from a rock landscape, clearing out the path for water. And once that was being done in parallel, in about a year's time, you start seeing, actually 2 years later, you start seeing the first drops of water coming into the system. And in about 3 years, the whole system is stable enough for the landscape and the build to work as one system. Now, as exciting as historic landscapes are, you can endlessly romanticize them. The idea here is not simply to say how great people were in the past. That is not the idea at all. But the idea is to say, how are some of these understandings of the relationship of the built settlement with the landscape can be used? Do they actually have value to address current day urbanization challenges? You'll need to understand the scales of the cities, the densities of the cities, because not everything can be transposed across landscapes. But it does hold many, many valuable examples, and you could unpack it to look at food security, water sequestration, flood mitigation, and many of the other things that plague our current day settlements. So using this kind of an understanding to say what kind of relationships exist, had existed in the past between the built and the natural. One of the practical applications was on the city of Bangalore. It's across 900 square kilometers, population around 11 million. So the challenges are very, very different. The scales change completely. So it's not like what you've learned there can be applied directly, but there is an inherent understanding of the relationship with the natural systems. And it, again, like many, many cities that have developed over time, Bangalore sits in a much larger landscape that has had human intervention over many centuries. The earliest one here dates about 1500 years ago. But the interventions had not always been seen as built. You did not see grand palaces and forts, but the interventions were across the landscape, where historically the region is called the city of 1,000 lakes, because they are an interconnected system. As an ecologist, you can't actually call them lakes. They are tanks built by humans, but in the usual language that we use, it's called lake. What's also interesting is that the lakes or tanks are not independent water management or reservoir systems, but it's a series of interconnected system of overflow reservoirs that spans a little over 8 or 9,000 square kilometers, 10 times bigger than the city itself. Now, what's also interesting is that we actually mapped, like most growing cities, the more the city grows, the more economy develops, the natural system also dies a very, very natural death. So where we had 230 odd tanks 50 years ago, now the city has about 30 live tanks. So there has been a reduction of about 90% in the number. Now, what is also interesting is to see how the death of these natural systems occurred, and there is a distinct correlation between the development of engineered systems, piped water, piped sanitation that was brought into the city. The more the engineered systems came into being, the faster the pace of death of the natural systems. Now, there can be many, many reasons, not just technical. There are social, cultural, political reasons. But this is a trend that can be seen across many, many cities. And like many metropolitan areas, including Medellin, while we know we are sitting on a region of 1,000 tanks, we don't think that's very valuable. We want to bring drinking water from 100 kilometers away. Bangalore also happens to sit on the top of a ridge, which means you not only have to convey the water, you have to pump the water, which makes the Bangalore Water Supply Agency the biggest consumer of energy in the state, only to pump water all the way from here to here. Of course, it doesn't end there, because not only are you pumping these 900 million liters of water every day, you also have to make sure what naturally falls on the landscape also has to be handled. But there are no more tanks and valleys to handle that, which means that you have excess water coming from outside, you have the natural water falling in, which means you engineer the drainage system more and more as each passing year to address flooding and things like that. And of course, needless to say, you also have to take all the wastewater 50 kilometers away and throw it, because you cannot possibly absorb it within the city itself. So what transpired was looking at the understanding of the relationship with the landscape and looking at how cities and engineered systems work. It was possible to develop a strategic plan. What I'm showing is only one part of it, where the planning districts are moved beyond the administrative boundaries, which typically happens everywhere. There are administrative boundaries drawn across little municipalities or the smaller units, which do not necessarily correspond to the natural limits. The moment you actually change the decision-making process to be based on the watershed and not only limited to the administration, the process itself and the priorities of these things change completely. You could actually look at development plans based on the inherent, what we call the land capacity for each of these watersheds. Though you are looking at a larger metropolitan area, the idea of decentralization, not just politically, which is very active in many of our countries, but you decentralize the services and the provision of resources, which essentially means that you increase the resilience of the system. You are no longer reliant on a far away source, and you reduce the vulnerability of the poorest, who often are the ones who suffer because they do not have access to resources. As a fallout, you can also notice, and this is no surprise for people from Medellin, but this is a pattern we have mapped across dozens of cities, where you can look at the incidence of informal settlements in cities, and you can very, very surely say which are the most ecologically sensitive areas of that city. They are almost always congruent with each other. And that has to do with planning history, how we value our land and city systems, and so on. I have no reason to put this here, but the day I was leaving India, I go cycling every morning, and I took this picture in my neighborhood. People, in this case, are plucking flowers, which they will then make into garlands and sell. And this is, of course, right outside Urbam. For me, this kind of a thinking is very interesting, because we don't necessarily have to be thinking at the large-scale ecosystem services that are provided in every city. It's the very small and minute. It may not be that this guy is hungry and needs the mango. It's also about how you relate to the natural system by design or by accident. So there is no reason for that slide to be here. So finally, the Bangalore exercise actually ended up informing policy at a much larger level that looked at mainly these things which bother most municipalities, the large-scale service provision and resolution of those systems. You will have to tell me the time. Somebody is keeping the time. How much time do I have? Thank you. Okay, I will run through this very quickly. So when we're looking at transitions, one of the most striking things, at least from where I come from, every city, every municipality wants to have a riverfront development project, right? And I think I'm speaking in the right city when I'm talking about this issue. Rivers, of course, have been used very differently across cultures. It depends on many, many things, whether it is fed by the rains, whether it is fed by the melting snow, changes the nature of the river, and traditionally how it is being used. And they're not just used as sources of water. The entire riverine landscape is used in different ways in different seasons. But when we actually want all of our cities to become global cities, we have very different aspirations. This is actually the most well-known riverfront project of India. It's in the city of Ahmedabad. This is a very objective. Google satellite images are very objective. You can just take pictures and they tell a story. And the idea of looking at it is that, of course, this is the month of this May, which is the height of summer. The river is barely a trickle, and the entire floodplain gets used as playgrounds, as informal agriculture, and many, many other uses. And you could actually see the same thing when the river is in spate, and it occupies a much larger landscape. But this is not very convenient to create an urban fabric. So we want a model that tells the river where to flow, how to behave. Of course, our inspiration for these come from imaginations that are driven by very different contexts. This is not to say the inspiration is wrong in its context, but how we use that inspiration in our own imaginations to build our aspirations. And this is what the same city front looks like. Which is Paris, which is Ahmedabad, which is a hot place, which is a cold place, really has very, very little to discuss in these pictures. This, by the way, is a landscape that touches about 48 degrees in the summer, but you still want it to look like Paris. So trees are usually a nuisance because they don't photograph very well in urban spaces. So it's nice to have clean, open spaces. But there are many other examples where our own work has been looking at rivers as dynamic systems and how urban systems should then respond to that. This is not to simply say that you don't touch the river or the river system at all, but there are very, very positive ways where you can include the dynamic nature of a river. Its varying flood levels, varying movements, as part of the city structure itself. Germany, for example, has been doing this over the last 20 years, where the idea of de-engineering systems has become very, very important. Of course, in the late 19th century, it was important to use the water and the rivers as transportation networks, but they also caused a lot of repercussions on the larger systems. So there are many positive examples of large-scale de-engineering of city and landscape systems. I am going to skip. I have 3 minutes left. So here are two images. One is the west coast of India, and the other is the mountains in Colombia, right? Very similar latitude, very similar altitude. And the reason I'm showing this is to say how in 200 years the landscape in India has been butchered by various developments, and you still have the time not to butcher this wonderful landscape, and you have living examples of how it had been done. So this is the landscape that the colonial rulers confronted. So this is not as pristine as one would imagine. There are lots of human settlements that happen in the valleys, but when the colonials came in, they obviously said, oh, the natives have deforested all the forests, so let's forest them. Because one's imagination of what is natural or wild is a certain imagination of a landscape. The intentions were good. So these are actually a series of very interesting vignettes from the same space. This is in the southern India on the Western Ghats, one of the biodiversity hotspots. This is early 1810, 1820. The first church was built with the barren hills in the background. The same thing started getting populated with exactly the same trees that you see in the Colombian landscape, which are the pines and the eucalyptus and all the fast-growing varieties. For a tourist, this is, of course, very beautiful, but the implications mean that this could have been the Western Ghats in India or Antioquia in Colombia, right? The process is exactly the same. This is not simply about mining versus not mining. It's also about the right kind of interventions that need to happen there. So needless to say, the entire downstream water resources have died because of these interventions. There is no more water in the valleys. The hills look still pretty, still popular with the tourists, but the downstream impact of these kind of decisions are enormous. We have tea in the place, and you have avocados. The difference is very little, but it's exactly the same way that we actually look at landscapes. So very, very quickly, after this very series of depressing stories, all is not so depressing. When you actually look at nature and natural systems, the regeneration capacity is immense. With very little intervention and very little time, you can actually bring about, I'm going to run through this before Alejandro kicks me out in the next 1.5 minutes. Just look at the dates where it's only a matter of a few months where the transformation in the landscape is being seen. Dead stream, live stream. Depleted groundwater system, healthy groundwater systems. Completely dried up landscapes to fairly healthy ones. So all the transformations that we are talking about are at either the site or neighborhood or maybe at the regional scale. But the interventions are, to use the same language that the social urbanism used, of the right kind of acupuncture at the right place. This is not large-scale engineering that brings about these things. Simply because my life is not very interesting these days, we chose this one particular project. I will take one more minute. Is when we're looking at the idea of transitions, how far can you push this idea? Is it merely creating little water bodies and tanks in cities, maybe bring back the fish? Or can you actually intervene where man has been most destructive on the planet, which is obviously the mining industry? So we are actually able to work with this mining company. I have no idea why they want us to do this, but the idea is to actually intervene in a functional mine, not a defunct mine. So while the mining is going on, how do you actually either stabilize or restore the ecological systems? So it was not only looking at the mine and the mining area, but it also looked at the larger region. There were the social issues, the food security, pollution, and many others. But the benchmarks that were set for this was very high. We were simply not interested in saying, okay, let's make the place green. We started with fairly larger benchmarks about carbon sequestration and things, but the biggest benchmark that we put on the company is that all the mines will become bird sanctuaries by 2020. Not sanctuaries, we can't use the word sanctuary, but bird habitats. And the transformation after the intervention started, remember these are live mining areas. It's not like dead areas, so you actually work with the mining managers to understand the process and do very small interventions across a very large landscape. All the pictures that you're going to see is a difference of about 15 to 18 months between the start of the intervention to the result that you see. And very large landscapes transformed with very, very small interventions. The landforms existed, the trees existed, but the way you would actually start looking at the soil and the watershed can bring about very, very massive changes. Large areas looking at grasslands. We were not making the mistake of planting trees. After having learned from the English, the idea is not to simply plant trees, but to enhance the natural capacity of that land. Maybe the land is simply a grassland that doesn't need a higher canopy, is what would get worked within this. Birds, of course, started coming back, including the extremely industrial areas. This is the actual processing plant where the interventions were continued. So this was not just in defunct areas across the place. The interventions also included neighboring communities and villages and not limited within the landscape, because whatever positive changes were being made in the mining area obviously had good fallout downstream to the other population. Bird count was done, 30% increase in 18 months. This is probably the biggest indicator, more than any other visual thing about green and water. The fact that there is now a healthy habitat in an area that continues to be mined was, I think, the biggest demonstration that was possible for this. So if I had to use, this is just opposite where I live, and I'm very interested. I keep looking at La Presidenta every single day. Every single day, morning and evening, I take a picture, because you can read many, many stories just looking at the way the flow varies. Do you know if it has rained upstream and not in your area? Is there a problem of deforestation, looking at the quality of water? You can read many stories in each of these things. And if there was one development point agenda I would put on Urbam for the city, is to actually look at every quebrada as a alive system that is not merely a drain or an efficient way to transport water, but that actually becomes part of the city fabric. Thank you. Did I take too much time?
Switch. Dim vorwärts, rückwärts.
Is the PowerPoint one okay, or you prefer the
PowerPoint
video?
is better, yeah. And this is
Prefer the
forward.
Yes, forward.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so this works. This is good. Thanks again for the invitation. I've been quite a frequent guest in Medellin, and it's always great to come back and walk in this great city and look at it. And I also find the quebradas always fascinating. And also, thanks for being able to have a co-talk today with Mohan, which I just learned to know today. So this is great. And I will use my half minutes or my half hour to talk a little bit about a few ideas that I'm working on, and also a discussion that we have in our school. The title is of the talk is The Inequality of Vulnerability, a topic that drives my research since a while now. And I will first talk a little bit about landscape architecture as something that I have to explain. I have the same problem. Now it goes. Because I started studying this field without really knowing what it is. And now I realize why I like it so much. And this is because of this diagram. That you are basically in the middle of three big fields: natural science, engineering, social and cultural science. And you sit there and you have to weave those things together. Otherwise, you will not be able to work well as a landscape architect. I probably stay over here. Okay. And a colleague of mine, Regine Keller and Undine Giesecke, they both say landscape architecture is a dirty discipline. And they are kind of proud of it. And I will explain that in a moment. But, you know, this is an image of the laderas in Medellin. And in order to engage in that situation in any positive way that might have a positive impact, one profession is not enough. You have to work on many, many, many levels. And so there was a social researcher in the 70s. His name was Horst Rittel, and he defined in social research that there are problems that have no solution. There are wicked problems. You might have a problem how to make your spaghetti, but it might not be a wicked problem. But how to solve drug abuse or war is a complex problem. And nobody can claim I have a solution for war or conflict or for drug abuse. And in the design professions, many people talk that the design and planning of a city or a landscape is a wicked problem. You cannot claim that you have a solution for it because the solution will have some issues that will leave out the huge complexity. And Horst Rittel even says, we have a problem to even define the problem. So if you claim you know what the problem is of Medellin, don't listen anymore. This is bullshit. Don't listen to the person anymore because it's impossible to say that. So this knowledge makes me also much more humble in my work. And I also train my students that they don't talk about solutions anymore. Then the other aspect I want to bring is the term of the Anthropocene. Mohan was also talking a little bit about the fact that there is little space on the planet that is untouched by humans. I actually claim, and I'm not alone, that there is no space that is untouched by humans, simply by the level that we manipulated the CO2 levels on the planet. And the CO2 levels on the planet are everywhere the same. If I am on the polar region or if I'm in Medellin, it's the same. And by increasing the levels, we change how plants behave, for example, how much CO2 they uptake, how they grow, so how the ice is formed. So we pretty much changed the whole planet. And there's a group of thinkers who claim, and geologists, who claim we live now in the Anthropocene, that the Holocene is over. And this is right now still a discussion. It's not a fact. It's not still accepted by the Geological Society. They have now a huge group doing research on it if it can be claimed. But this thing doesn't like me. The people who propose the Anthropocene, they show you these tables. And they are in German right now because I copied them out of a German book, but they differentiate them into developments of the Earth system, and they all show these curves that go up. And it starts always in 1750, and it ends in 2010. And for example, this would say this is agriculture on the planet. This is loss of tropical forest. This is catchment of fish, and so on. So, and they say, okay, they mark a point in 1950 where most of these curves suddenly go up. And the claim is right now the Anthropocene starts around that time. And I can push. So, do you have a better way? Okay.
To stay here.
Stay lower. Okay. And the other one they show is the socio-economical developments. So if it is transport of goods, if it's telecommunication, if it's international tourism, if it's population, if it's urbanism. And they are called these hockey curves. So we live in the age of hockey curves. And we are somewhere riding the end of the stick of the hockey curve. And so I would agree, I don't know if we ever can call it Anthropocene, but we know that these curves are out there. So that's a fact. I don't care what you call it. But that it's there and it's something you have to deal with it. But there are also people that point out all the discussion about the Anthropocene is missing another big point. And that is inequality on the planet. Oxfam, a couple of years ago, made this calculation that there are 8 people on the planet that own as much as the lower or the poorer half of the planet. So 8 against 3.6 billion. And out of this equation, it becomes very clear where the power is. And the 8 people are known, obviously, because a billionaire cannot hide. So this is hard. And they have lots of power. Also how we, of course, with the new digital economy, 4 of the 8 people are owners of big digital economy firms. So, and opinions are made. So there's clearly, we have the hockey curves and we have this huge inequality. And of course, there is a reason why this number is there. That 90% of all death in disasters is in low and middle income countries. So we have these hockey curves, we have the climate change, global warming, we have the consequences of it in an increase in disasters, and as Mohan showed, the huge flooded areas. The most vulnerable people are the ones that are at the lower end of the economical inequality. So in the last statistic I will bother you is with the number of the 3 billion people will need access to adequate housing by 2030, that's in 10 years. So in my profession that is working on landscape connected to cities and urbanism, this is incomprehensible in the end. It's something we cannot fully understand, because we just heard the numbers that right now 3.9 billion people are living in cities. So if another 3 billion 3.9 billion don't have adequate housing already. 1 billion people live in what the UN terms as slums. So they would need adequate housing, obviously, but there's another 2 billion that needs that in 10 years. So this is an incredible challenge, and challenge is actually not the right word for it, because it's something that cannot be easily done. So if you take these things together, there is definitely a wicked problem here. And there's definitely something where pretty much all professions have to engage in. It's bigger than us. So when we look at the planet, and now the phenomena of urbanization, most of it will happen in Asia and Africa, and also when Mohan looks at his country, this is where most of it will happen. And of course, where we are right now, there's of course still urban growth, obviously, but it's not that massive anymore as in Asia and Africa. With Latin America, with 80% of urbanization already happened. It's mostly like right now, how to improve that urbanization. So for me, it was always interesting to go to Latin America, because you urbanized so fast. When you look at Sao Paulo, but also Medellin in the last 100 years, you can see all these small footprints of cities in 1870, and then boom. And there you can see what happens if something grows very fast. So for me, Latin America is often a window into the past of urbanization that will happen in Africa and Asia to come. So can we learn from that? Sure. But what do we do with it? I will show you just one example out of the conclusions I'm taking. In Port-au-Prince, in Haiti, I happened to work there after the earthquake, where 1 year after the earthquakes, 80% of the city in Port-au-Prince, a city from 4.5 million, so a little bit bigger than Medellin, was in ruins, where 680,000 lived in camps. So this is one of the camps. And where, okay, cannot walk away. And we are here 1.5 years, well, let's say 1.5 years after the earthquake. The president of Haiti, Michel Martelly, and the former president of the United States, Bill Clinton, laid a foundation of a new housing settlement of how many houses? 400. 400 houses against 680,000 in tents. And it was meant to be a settlement that basically can be copied and so on. And we studied it, we worked on it, and the first thing I saw was, as a good landscape architect, that it was in a flood zone. You see the circle there, close to the ocean, that it was also in a hurricane alley. And on the day where they opened it, there was already ponding water, because they filled the site and they blocked the natural drainage of the water to the ocean. So we worked on this in a small team with MIT professors Phil Thompson, and I was still at Harvard. And we were supposed to work on this, and we proposed a flood management issue, because this was the only construction site that was available. And we proposed that this will be built over phases, that this is actually a training site for carpenters, masonry, electricians, for gardeners, etc., to train them and to help rebuild Haiti. And so it was in an incremental phase, and we structured 500 days how this settlement could grow. And of course, when we presented our ideas, the bulldozers were already out there, and were building a site, because it had to go fast, and they were building houses on that site. and they could take photographs after 30 days of the 400 houses, which were not connected to water, not connected to sewage. They had a little bit of electricity in the beginning. So this was the so-called trophy housing, where you can take photographs that you say, okay, we built houses. So it was clear for us we should not work with the government, or definitely not with the big foundations there. And we visited at the same time a settlement where people built their own houses outside of Port-au-Prince. It was called Canaan. And there were already 30,000 people there building their own houses. Nobody helped them because it was not allowed to build there. And this is what the site looked like in 2011. So you see these settlements that were actually built by the government, again, way too close next to a river. And this is a couple of years later, an estimated 50,000 to 200,000 people built there. So it was clear to us, this is where we should work, and not in the trophy housing sector. But in the beginning, we were not allowed to work there. We worked there anyway, and started with students a project in a small neighborhood of this settlement, and helped them to develop their settlement. This is the person who really ran it, Johann Christian Hannemann. He was at the time a student who made his master thesis, and they spent a couple of weeks there and worked with a small group of residents and an NGO locally there to develop the housing in a better way. And it was really bottom-up work, groundwork that was done in all directions. But it was also connected to the environmental engineering at the Technical University Munich that was carried the project there, where they studied the flood risk of this area, and then these mappings were then communicated in simple drawings in workshop to the people who were living in these areas. And we found that through this student work and the immersion into the process there without large donors worked very well. And there were drawings made to develop the settlement. There was a street naming project, so you have an address in a street. And there were then, after 2014, the government realized these people will not go away, and they were officially now making plans to help this, and more NGOs came. There were tree planting projects, etc. So it's far from ideal, obviously. The real issue was that the government and the international community did not procure land that people could build their own houses. The bigger problem was that it's also in the politicians' head what should be a proper city. I will come to that in a minute. I will end soon. I just talk to you why I'm here in Medellin today, to work with URBAM and a team from the city and a team from from some schools in Germany on the laderas. It's a topic that we started already to work together since 2011 and made reports with the URBAM team and with the team in Hanover. And out of that study that looked at the laderas, the risk there were pilot projects that were proposed. I won't go into detail on that. And one pilot project we are now pursuing that I will tell you more in a second. But I want to say that out of these studies, I learned that we have to have a different culture of planning, obviously. We are not working with as a profession, working well with the, let's say, disadvantaged half of the planet, the 3.6 billion against the 8, that our schools don't teach us well in that. I would make an exception that in Medellin now it's done. But in Europe it's not done, and in United States either. It's still a side topic, so we started to have workshops and conferences on it, published on it, and have what Alejandro told you with the UN Habitat Hub on informal urbanism, meetings with mostly young researchers to build the next generation of designers and planners who are working inside these complex problems. So we were just coming out of Zurich with a conference, it's called Shareland. And 2 years ago now, we were in Hanover with a conference on dangerous landscapes. That means on the risky landscape. And we also have to have a different culture of ideals. I mean, this thing is that two elected leaders plant the seed of a city that should look like that is a problem, obviously. And when you have 400 houses against 200,000 people that build their own houses in the end, something is not right. And how do you get the idea into these heads that this could be a model that could be better pursued and be better done? This is the challenge, and that's not only the problem of the politicians, but we elect the politicians that have their thoughts in their head. Obviously, that's why we also started to go more public. We did just an exhibition last year and a year ago where 5 landscape architecture teams showed their work on 10 projects all over the planet. In public spaces, we did not stay in the confines of the academy. This show was shown in the Pinakothek der Moderne, Modern Art Museum in Munich, and it was shown in Hanover, open to the public, because we wanted to show that, hey, the urbanization that you see in your magazine is just a quarter of the urbanization that's really happening out there. So this is what the show looked like, just to give you a feeling. Medellin, the work that we did together with Alejandro Echeverri in Urbam was shown in this presentation. There's a book on it. And of course, what we also learned is that we have to develop a different culture of interaction. How do we talk to people? How do we engage? We are still learning that. How do I engage as a German when I come to Medellin with the residents, with the people that live there? A lot of things were learned in Haiti, that in terms of collaboration. And of course, and that's the hardest, is the different culture of thinking. In Medellin, when we started the work, we really had to notice that all what we learned, we have to redo that a little bit as designers, because the most basic level of our thinking was the geology of the site. And so in red, you see all the areas that cannot be modified, that are risky for people to live there. We looked into, this is one of the pilot projects that we are now pursuing, to work to develop an alarm and evacuation system in the hills. And that is a test. And of course, we have to work there with many disciplines and people on it. I'm here today with also members of the Technical University of Munich. My dear colleague Kurosh Turo sits here. He's a geotechnical engineer, so he knows the ground. And we were just out there on the site today, and he was holding up a big stone. He was saying, look, there are 5 billion of years of development you see here. And this is just fantastic. And so we developed a process that is hopefully very integral for that. And we have, of course, We want to test this in a certain site in the hills where the community is our anchor point, and then there's a team built of the Colombian and the German side on this project. And of course, it mixes through with the different expertises. And in the end, it comes back to this person. Is Bruno Latour. He's a French philosopher. I know they are not easy to read, but he's our current saint, because his whole work is about saying, guys, now we are at a point where the dissection into natural sciences, social sciences, cultural sciences does not work for us anymore. It's too separate. It does not help with the problems that we have today. So he thinks of a network thinking. How do you get it together? I don't know if I translated it right. Pensamiento en red. So that, and this network thinking is really hard. Of course, we are all trained as professionals, but how do we get it together? This is really a challenge, but I think only if we do that, we can go forward. Thank you very much.
Bueno, vamos a hacer la sesión de preguntas. Regálenme 30 segundos, yo prendo estos dos aparaticos. Creo que con un micrófono nos… ¿Aló? Aquí están. Okay. Bueno, yo… muchas gracias por la ponencia y las presentaciones. Yo creo que son supremamente pertinentes y necesarias. Yo creo que un poco el esfuerzo que creo que tenemos juntos es cómo poner en evidencia y de alguna manera de forma más visible no solo los retos que tenemos, sino yo creo que las oportunidades también. Yo no quisiera que termináramos con una visión trágica de que el problema es de tales dimensiones como es, que no tiene solución. Yo creo que también hay espacios extraordinarios de innovación y de innovación desde estas situaciones extremas que pueden de alguna manera replicarse en todo tipo de ciudades. Yo voy a darle la palabra al público, pero primero voy a hacer una reflexión y una pregunta simplemente para que si ustedes quieren hacer un comentario. Estamos con esa idea de qué tipo de profesional necesitamos, ¿no? ¿Qué formación necesitamos en el marco del diseño? Cuando hablamos de infraestructuras, urbanismo, paisaje. Y como les mencionaba ahora, estamos trabajando en la idea de un nuevo pregrado. y creo que hay que reformatear, redefinir los formatos pedagógicos, también el tema de dijéramos, de los contenidos de los programas en relación con acercarlos más a la realidad y en donde podamos hacer una incidencia real, dijéramos. Y hay una dimensión que es muy importante que tiene que ver con la posición ética y moral y la capacidad de ser consecuentes y responsables de nuestras acciones, que en las escuelas de urbanismo, arquitectura, no es muy común que nosotros hagamos esa evaluación primero, ¿no? La hacemos después. Entonces, yo quiero dejar esa pregunta, si tienen algunos de ustedes algún tema, alguna idea para compartir sobre eso, y sobre todo aprovechar el tiempo de ustedes para darle la palabra al público y tener 4 o 5, no sé cuántas preguntas tenemos tiempo de hacer. No sé si alguno quiere empezar.
Okay. He already has a question.
No, pero la pregunta es después.
Okay.
Qué pena. El espacio va a ser para ustedes, pero yo quiero dejar esta reflexión inicial para que ellos nos comenten 2 o 3 cosas sobre este tema de la formación, y ya te damos la palabra a ti primero y después, listo.
Thank you. Yeah, even when I started, one of the first observations I made about the value of URBAM in this space, where you're actually looking at breaking the boundaries between the many disciplines, and that's not really easy. One of the fashionable things we all want to say is about how interdisciplinary our work is. Most of the time, it's something fairly superficial, even for the most serious practitioners, because the challenge is not about a student learning from different disciplines. The challenge is to find the people who are actually able to think and teach from different disciplines together. And, you know, like Christian put in the many graphs and the Venn diagrams that we see, the kind of intersections that we have between society, culture, economics, natural systems are simply enormous. Frequently, they are wicked problems. However, I think like we changed the way we taught medicine in the beginning of the 20th century, it's really important to change the paradigm of the teaching. You're no longer teaching about how to cure a cold or how to cure a headache, but you're actually looking at the human body as an integral whole. So no matter what specialization you take on later, you actually need to learn about the system first. I mean, that's the best analogy that I can think of in the case of urbanism, that you need to create the generalist first before they can actually specialize. Now, our current model of education is actually the reverse, that we all come from very super specialized areas of working and on the field start working in general areas simply because you meet and work with so many people. So especially if you're looking at it at the undergraduate level, I think the opportunity is very precious, and also the chances of making it successful at an undergrad level are much higher than trying to do it at the postgrad level.
Well, I totally agree with you, Mohan. I mean, that's clear. And how do you reverse that? Education is probably a long-term project, because the division of the sciences started in the 16th century in Europe, and it's 400 years in the making. And there's also a certain pride in all the cultural. I mean, the natural scientists have a pride in their culture and so on. This is something about that Latour writes about, obviously, that there is already so much ingrained in us that it's really hard to get out of it. And we notice also that in our education, that when we start to integrate other disciplines with our students, it's really hard. they have a hard time finding together. And I know of studies where people were there for 1 year together and then we were going out into different disciplines, close to what medical doctors do, that they study together and then they branch out and into disciplines, and maybe that's a smaller approach in generally. But I think there has to be a reform of how we teach, and it has because we are not really addressing the problems that are right now. I mean, that's the issue.
Muy bien, entonces ya te damos la palabra, te presentas y nos haces la pregunta y después seguimos pasando. Perdón, estoy con mucha gana de hablar, ¿o qué? No, hagamos 3 preguntas seguidas y contestamos, ¿cierto? Para que ellos contesten.
Buenas noches, mi nombre es Juan Esteban. Yo no sé si sea una pregunta, es una reflexión y quisiera su opinión. Y retomo las palabras tuyas al principio sobre el tiempo. Pienso que las ciudades están en unos desarrollos tan acelerados que contrarrestar los efectos de la sobrepoblación es un reto de pronto utópico, ¿sí? Llegar a esas soluciones se vuelve difícil. ¿Será que hay que pensar de una manera más macro e intentar que las personas salgan de las ciudades y generar un éxodo a la parte rural? Y esto implicaría que los planes de ordenamiento territorial tengan que ser no solo de la ciudad, sino también del contexto general en el cual se vive. Y para esto pienso que debe haber una nueva concepción de la vida de las personas. Si nos vamos a lo rural, al campo, se pueden generar unas comunidades autosuficientes que cultiven, que convivan, donde haya un estudio, que pienso que es el punto álgido de la idea, cómo estudiar a nuestros hijos en ese nuevo entorno, y para eso existe ya la virtualidad y superaríamos esa gran limitante. Mi reflexión es decir, no deberíamos también concentrar esfuerzos en cambiar el modelo de convivencia entre nosotros y descongestionar un poco las ciudades llevando a las personas al campo.
Hello, my name is Philip Ulbrich. I'm from the University of Warwick, a researcher, and I've got a question for Christian. You mentioned that you engaged differently, and it would be interesting to know how differently did you, what did you learn, how did you engage differently, and yeah, and then when you engaged, what did you learn, what did you do differently afterwards?
Hola, mi nombre es Aurora. Pues usualmente, digamos, las personas que viven en estas áreas de alto riesgo son personas que realmente no les interesa a la hora de la verdad mucho sobre, digamos, su condición de riesgo, y también no les interesa esa relación de sus casas con, digamos, con la naturaleza, porque ellos tienen también una presión social, tienen, digamos, la presión de sobrevivir, de buscar su sustento, ¿sí? Entonces, ustedes han tenido, digamos, ¿cómo han lidiado con eso? ¿Cómo logran llegar a esa comunidad que realmente no tiene ánimos o ganas de aplicar esa relación?
So about the question between the rural and the urban, when I started working on this, I also thought this might be one of the improvements that we could do, and I got a little bit disillusioned by it. This was in a conference with UN Habitat, where somebody who was in the first conference in Vancouver, I think it was in 1976, a large Habitat 1 conference, where all the people agreed that we have to strengthen the rule. and that we have to find ways that people stay in the countryside, that farmers can make a living again, that we build infrastructure of schools and work opportunities, that people don't need to go to the city. So that was the 1976 outcome of the Vancouver thing. And then they met 20 years later in Istanbul in 96. And then he told they were trying to get the results of all the efforts that were done in the countryside, and they had to acknowledge they failed. And then 96 was the understanding that we have failed in that, we have tried hard. Now we have all these informal housing areas in the cities because we have focused too much on the countryside. Let's focus now on the city. And so 96 was then the call to focus on the city, and cities are our future. And that continued with Quito in 2016, kind of that thinking, but with sustainability. So despite all the efforts, it seemed almost like a natural force that people leave the countryside all over the planet. And there are people who are saying this is, we are urban by nature. It was a famous slogan by Dirk Simons in the Netherlands, in Rotterdam. So I don't have a bad answer on this. I would also like to see this, but right now a lot of the forces are against it, especially when it comes to farming. Then to the other question in terms of how do I engage differently? This is mostly that I learned over the process to value the process of engagement. How you actually perform your design work is equally as important as what the result is. As designers, architects and landscape architects, we're always so trained to make a drawing of something in the future, a transformation of a beautiful city, of a beautiful house, of a beautiful garden, and then we assume somehow that there's a construction crew who builds that, and then somehow the money is there to do that, and it just doesn't work like that. And it works maybe for a couple of rich people, but for the rest it doesn't work that well. In Germany we have very tight regulations in terms of construction. It works to a certain degree, but not even there it doesn't work anymore. We have huge protests against large master planning projects. The citizen involvement in Germany is now a huge force when it comes to how the city is generated, and there is also a guerrilla movement where people occupy land in the city illegally in Germany. So, and this all taught me that the process has to be different, and of course, still searching. Obviously, it has to do with treating first the people you work for as the client and as equals, and not in a patronizing way that is the all-knowing master planner from the 50s who decides for you what is right for you. I think that's right now an acknowledgement in a lot of the urban planning and design fields that you have to treat that stronger, and I hope this continues. And then the last one with the interest in risk. I agree with that. When we worked with Urbam in the hills and did lots of interviews of the people, they all knew they were in risk areas. Some said, okay, my house is safe, but my neighbor is in danger. Or some people would say, yes, my house is in danger, but I have other problems. I have to put food on the table. And but there was an underlying stress about it, obviously, and if you could relieve that stress, I think it might be already a big help. And what we so far encountered, if I'm not wrong, Alejandro, is that when we put forward our proposals in one of the warning system for landslides, the people were very much interested in it. So there was a strong interest in it. If you, in terms of how if in the application, if it will work long term, how many people will engage in it, we have to find out. We also know there are trust issues, obviously, with the government. So we have been at a site today where there has been a landslide. And we were also told that people were told about it, and people should be evacuated, but some didn't want to leave the house because they didn't trust the government. So this is a complex issue. I don't have a full answer for you yet.
For me, actually, the first and the third question are quite related, because it's also about who is defining the problem and is there a problem. It comes back to what you said at the beginning of the lecture about how we define the problem, because all these things are being defined by outsiders. I may have worked with the community for 20 years, I'm still an outsider. I don't have the same pressures, I don't have the same demands on my time and resources like they do, because I have a home to go back to somewhere else, right? And this is not just a question of poverty. I can give you many cases of middle or even rich people who take enormous risks. How many obese people do we know who do not want to stop eating? And I'm not being funny. You know the dangers of eating a certain kind of food. Maybe there are other things that I'm not aware of. It's easy enough to advise them, right? It's the same when we define the risk. I think you're in a high-risk area and you should move. Maybe there are 400 other priorities for that family before they can think of the safety of the house. So, and that actually relates to the first question, because this is our imagination of what an ideal human society should be. From a certain framework that we come from, you very correctly mentioned 400 years of indoctrination that we have had. We have actually come to a point where we have a universal standard for humanity. Everybody should get so many liters of water, so much of education, you should live for so long, you should have so much of vitamins. We have a global standard, which I think is a very unfortunate way to look at us in an entire species. You live in different altitudes, you eat different food, you have different levels of sunshine. The number of parameters that you want to put on it as an algorithm is enormous. But somehow to reduce this to one universal solution, I mean, there have been many historical experiments. Other than before the Montreal thing, you would remember the 1960s Cultural Revolution in China. A country that actually was able to do what we are talking, move millions across the landscape in a place of your choice. They continue to do that even today. It has not shown any results. You still have, even in a closed and structured society like that, you have informal settlements in cities. So if it cannot work in China, and I'm not giving that as a bad example, I'm simply giving that as a strong example of what we imagine solutions to be from one perspective. It could be of an ecologist or an urban planner or whatever. Two things can happen. Either our definition of the problem is wrong, or it's a classic wicked problem where we are only trying to solve one aspect of it. The temptation to feel success is there in all of us. And to feel that success, we end up pushing the wrong buttons many times.
Bueno, vamos a hacer la última sesión de preguntas. Si ustedes tienen preguntas o tiempo, las 2 o 3 preguntas si hay, para cerrar la sesión de esta noche y darle a nuestros queridos invitados las gracias, que creo que ha sido muy importante y muy productiva, dijéramos, el diálogo. No sé si hay alguna otra pregunta en el público. Estás tú, para que te presentes también. Estás tú, y habrá alguna tercera, o con las 2 preguntas cerramos. Muy bien, hagamos estas 2 preguntas y cerramos. 2 more questions and we end.
Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Paula. Una pregunta para Mohan, si podrías ampliar cómo fue esa intervención puntual en alguno de los procesos ecológicos o de restauración y cómo la enlazaron con la comunidad más cercana. Y para Christian, ¿por qué si Bruno Latour en el libro Facing Gaia dice el antropoceno es uno de los conceptos más decisivos de este momento Hay otro autor que dice, no hay antropoceno, sino hay una geopolítica del antropoceno, porque la pregunta es, ¿podrías ampliar cuando dices, puede que el antropoceno tenga una fecha de comienzo 1950, pero no tiene el punto de the great de la gran desigualdad incluido? ¿Podrías ampliar un poco ese pensamiento? Gracias.
Gracias. Buenas noches, mi nombre es Edwin y yo quería preguntar si era posible o cómo creen ustedes que se puede medir, si creen que es posible, medir la resiliencia y cuáles métodos, la pregunta va para los dos, cuáles métodos creen que serían, digamos, los apropiados para medirla y hacerla comparativo en diferentes lugares, digamos.
Answering the first question, you see, the importance was not merely the academic or the research part of establishing the relationship. Often in societies like ours, heritage has very different meanings for different people. While architects and conservation architects are very excited about it, in many cases, and I'm not only referring to India, I can refer to many cases in Southeast Asia and Central Africa, where heritage actually becomes a nuisance for the local community. And every time we have something declared as a heritage site or a World Heritage Site, you actually see enormous implications on the development for local people because it becomes a restriction. It's like living in a museum. You can't live your natural life and you're expected to live what the Paris Convention tells you to. So the idea of doing this was also very important for us to actually do a real-time engagement with the community so that their everyday actions, which is to do with living in that landscape as farmers, as traders, as anything else, could actually be seen as a continuum from the heritage, which meant that there was a greater sense of ownership and participation in the process. So I think that was a very important outcome of this beyond the academic way of looking at it. I hope that answers your question.
All right. About the Anthropocene, obviously. The graphs that I showed, they had no inequality in it. There was no inequality graph. And I wanted to get one, and I was looking, and I didn't find any. And there are, even that there are lots of books written about it right now. And of course, I imagine there were times in our human history where inequality was massive with dictators and kings, etc. So it's probably not a hockey curve, and it's probably something like that on the planet. But this concept is missing around the current discussion of the Anthropocene was pointed out by Robert Nixon. He is a professor for literature in Princeton, and he wrote the book Slow Violence. That's very commendable. That describes basically slow violence and the concept of things that slowly kill us and that are injustice, like all environmental catastrophes, etc., that hit certain people that were in 99% of the cases not causing the environmental catastrophe. And so he basically points that out in several articles that this concept is missing. And noticed, yes, it's missing. We're talking about the socio-economical, we're talking about the changes in the structural system of the earth, but not about inequality, and it's a massive thing. So this is where it comes from. Then the other question about can resilience be measured? I think the resilience discussion is now very hot since 10 years. There are conferences every year about it, and lots of books are written about it. And it has been kind of the success of sustainability as a term. And already in the term of sustainability, people have failed to, in the end, to really declare what is sustainable, for whom, for what, for how long. In the end, it's an admirable concept, but in order to put numbers on it, I think the people who have tried it, they never fully, I think, made it. Same with the World Health Organization that tells you how much water you should consume and how much green space you need, etc. So the same is with resilience in my eyes. There are certain key principles that people talk about, like redundancy, flexibility, resiliency itself to come back after a hard event, etc., which I think are good, like the sustainable principle. But as soon as you try to put hard numbers on it, sometimes it gets unjust, and these ideas that you bring the different spheres together gets then lost in pure numbers. And I know you would like to have indicator numbers when you have, say, something is resilient now, but I'm not so concerned about these numbers. I'm rather concerned about the principles that are behind it. For example, the principle of redundancy, I think, is very interesting, and that a system that fails has other ways to make up for it. I think it's more interesting to pursue those aspects than to think about numbers.
Sorry, I forgot to respond to the resilience question. Yes, to have some principles are very good, but I don't think we can reduce them to a standard baseline, because how a community is resilient in Medellin may be vastly different from the community in Cali. I'm not even talking of a different country, right? Because the idea of resilience, of course, is, for example, how the principle of redundancy. It could be about how much time and at what cost can I recover my life. Is it merely a physical cost? Is it a social? Is it psychological? There are many, many different ways to measure this. I mean, post-traumatic disorder syndrome that we find, not just in war areas, but in natural disaster areas, is something that cannot be measured. Many of us who work in disaster areas actually go through that, but there's no way you can actually measure the trauma that you actually go through. So I think it's extremely contextual. Different communities have different strengths in terms of how much they can resist, or how much they can fight back, or how fast and easily they can come back to. Different systems have different resilience. The US economic system you can count after the housing bust, where the banks were saved, but all the people lost their houses. Now, is the system really resilient? If I were to use technical numbers, it would give me a very different result from what happened on the ground. So, principles I would definitely use. I would at best use human cost, but it's really not an indicator. Human cost, again, is not only in life terms, but could be emotional in many, many ways. So I would be very wary of actually creating an indicator system for especially resilience.
Muy bien, vamos a cerrar la sesión de las dos presentaciones. El diálogo, yo creo que hay muchas ideas, muchas preguntas también, pero yo creo que muchas luces en ese sentido. Está claro que tenemos que acercarnos más a los procesos para entenderlos. La proximidad y la sensibilidad es importante, pero también la inteligencia puesta allí. Entonces yo quiero simplemente darles un agradecimiento a Cristian, a Mohan, pues, y darles iba a decir un pequeño aplauso, pero démosles un gran aplauso a ellos. Y espero que sigan siendo de esta casa, ¿no? You have to come back very often. Okay. Gracias a todos ustedes. Gracias y gracias a todo el equipo de Urban, a Juliana, a Ana, Camilo, que nos ayudaron a organizar y lideraron todo esto. Juli, gracias. Muy bien, Juli. Sí.